Subcommittee will come to order. This morning's hearing is on the 35th anniversary of the Staggers Rail Act. But before we get started with the hearing itself, I think that it's important to let the American public know that it's with a heavy heart we are given the notice of this tragic accident in Philadelphia. Last night we saw something horrific that was unimaginable, that we would never expect to see on our passenger rail. So this morning, myself, Ranking Member Capuano, the Chairman, and Ranking Member would each like to make a statement. First of all, I want to commend the first responders and the fellow travelers that helped out those that were injured in this accident. We have now seen the federal officials, both from the National Transportation Safety Board and the Federal Rail Administration, respond quickly. I think the American public is looking for answers on how this can happen. And we've held several hearings now on rail safety, and that'll be the question that this committee continues to follow up on and ask as well. Again, we express our condolences to the loved ones who've lost or has someone missing or injured in this accident. I now turn it over to the Ranking Member, Mike Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join you in everything you just stated, and I'd also just like to offer my prayers, and I guess on behalf of everyone, to be perfectly honest, to offer the prayers for those who are still in the hospital who are suffering. May God bring them a speedy recovery and bring them back to health as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The full committee chairman, Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Denham. Obviously, it's a horrific accident. As the chairman said, something that we haven't seen like that in some time. The National the Transportation Safety Board is obviously up there looking at it. We certainly don't know why. I've heard some politicians already come out and say if we would have spent more money, maybe that's the case, but it's something I think we really need to take a serious look at that and, first of all, figure out what happened up there. Because the Northeast Corridor is extremely important to the nation. That's why Chairman Denham and myself worked hard with Ranking Member Capuano and DeFazio to put out a passenger rail reform bill focusing really on the Northeast Corridor, making sure those profits for the Northeast Corridor get put back into the Northeast Corridor. So, again, it's waiting for some action in the Senate. We hope that they'll take a serious look at it, and especially with this accident, because hundreds of millions of people ride the Northeast Corridor, not just Amtrak, but all those daily commuters from SEPTA to New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and all the way up that corridor. So it's critical we find out exactly what happened up there and make sure that we take the appropriate response to make sure it doesn't happen again. And with that, yield back.
With that, we'll start with our panel members. Let me just first start with opening statements on the hearing this morning. Railroads have played a important and integral role in this country since railroading came onto the transportation scene in the early 1800s. In fact, most American cities and towns, especially in the Midwest and West, were founded along the railroads. Today, they're the backbone of the nation's freight system, transporting 40% of all freight volume, more than any other mode. They transport 30 million carloads of freight every year, ranging from coal to agriculture products to intermodal shipments. In fact, our freight rail system is the envy of the world, and countries, as we travel around, we hear most often that other countries are envious and look to emulate our rail system in their countries. However, it was not long ago when America's freight rail system was in complete disarray. By the 1970s, battered by competition from trucking and airlines and hampered by burdensome regulations, railroads were dying a slow death. Their infrastructure was falling apart. Customers were not getting efficient service. Railroad bankruptcies were an all too common occurrence. Congress tried several acts to fix the system, even going as far as getting into the business of creating railroads, yet nothing seemed to work. It wasn't until the Staggers Act that Congress was able to find the mix of policies to get the system working again. First, it allowed railroads to act more like true businesses by allowing them to charge market-driven rates rather than ones handed down from Washington bureaucrats. Second, the act allowed railroads to right-size their networks by focusing on rail lines that made economic sense. And finally, it encouraged the creation of the short line railroads to serve those regional markets that the larger Class I railroads could not do economically. 35 years later, we can see the benefits of these changes in the strong rail system that we have today. However, while we have had great success with the Staggers, we need to make sure the regulatory system still works well. The service issues the railroads had last winter was a good reminder of this and of the important role of the STB, the Surface Transportation Board, and the role that they play with rail and with our customers. So today, we're going to hear from the STB, railroads, and other importance of the Staggers Act reforms. I also look forward to hearing the future of how best railroads can serve America. In closing, look forward to the hearing and would now like to recognize Mr. Capuano for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep mine brief. Basically, the Staggers Act, as we all know, was a great act. It was really an improvement and an advancement in the rail industry. Yet with all good acts, they require and demand and deserve continuous monitoring and attention and updating and amendments if and when they're necessary. And to me, that's what I'm hoping to find out from this hearing is it working as hoped? Are there any improvements? Are there any tweaks we can make to it? Should we completely leave it alone? Should we roll it back? I mean, not that I would agree with any of those statements, but I want to hear other people's opinions. And with that, I will simply yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Chairman of Full Committee, Mr. Schuster.
Well, I want to thank Chairman Denham and Capuano for holding this hearing today. It's been one of the committee's priorities to look at the movement of freight across this country, whether it's by rail, whether it's by highway, by water. So again, we look forward to whether we passed WRDA last year or the Surface Transportation Bill or the FAA reauthorization, making sure we're doing the right things to strengthen all the modes of transportation. The Department of Transportation is projecting that freight volumes will increase significantly over the next few decades, and we need to prepare for that growth, again, through all the modes. As Chairman Denham noted, railroads have played a critical role in moving large quantities of freight long distances, so we need to make sure that we're doing the right things here in Congress to stay out of the way when necessary, but to assist where necessary with the transportation system. After 35 years, it's clear the Staggers Act has been successful, and we can learn from it what it's done to the railroad, and I think across all the modes in ways to upgrade, change our infrastructure. I always like to point out that the railroads reinvest 19% of their revenues, not their profits, their revenues back into their infrastructure, which 2015, I believe, is projected to be $29 billion. Volume's up, productivity's increased, safety has improved, and the financial health of the industry is strong. We have, though, seen some disruptions because of the winter in 2013 and 2015. And again, there's concern with shippers as to the STB's relief procedures. I think so it's a good time to revisit the regulatory environment of the railroads. And in response to some of those concerns, I know our counterparts in the Senate have produced an intriguing bill that we need to take a careful look at. But I hope that we look at that. When we look at that bill, we realize we have a very strong railroad industry. And over the past 35 years, it's gone from being not strong to very strong, and I think again we need to do what's right here in Congress to make sure that we maintain the strength of our railroad industry, which, as Chairman Denham said, is the envy of the world. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to welcome our panel of witnesses. First, the Honorable Deborah Miller, Acting Chair of the Surface Transportation Board. The Honorable Calvin Dooley, President and CEO of the American Chemistry Council. The Honorable Ed Hamburger, President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads. And Linda Darr, President of American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. And John Mayo, Professor, Georgetown University. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Ms. Miller, welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Schuster, Subcommittee Chairman Denham, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Capuano, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Deb Miller. I'm the acting chair of the Surface Transportation Board. What I'd like to do this morning is give you a brief look back at the history of the ICC and a brief look forward, looking at the priorities today of the Surface Transportation Board. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the predecessor agency of the Surface Transportation Board, was the first federal regulatory agency created in 1887. Over time, the ICC grew into a massive organization with 2,900 employees at its peak. But by the late 1960s, the railroad industry in the United States was in decline. One reason was competition from other modes, but another major contributing factor was excessive regulation. Railroads were not given the flexibility needed to manage their business in this new competitive environment. They were governed by burdensome and Byzantine regulations. By the early 1970s, the situation was so perilous there was even talk of nationalizing the rail industry. In response, Congress passed a series of laws aimed at deregulating the industry and in what many considered a last-ditch attempt to save it. The most sweeping of these was the Staggers Act, passed in 1980. The Staggers Act instituted a number of changes to the regulatory landscape. First, it allowed railroads to more easily abandon unprofitable lines. Second, it made it easier for railroads to merge. Third, it provided exemption authority to quickly approve transactions that were routine and non-controversial. Most significantly, though, Staggers gave railroads greater pricing freedom. Railroads were allowed to engage in differential pricing, meaning they could charge different shippers different rates depending on the demand for that traffic. Since passage of the Staggers Act, the railroad industry has become more efficient, productive, and profitable. In 1995, Congress sunsetted the ICC and created the Surface Transportation Board. Today, the agency's mission is still governed by many of the principles established by Staggers. The board is charged with promoting an efficient, competitive, safe, and cost-effective rail network by enabling railroads to earn adequate revenues that foster reinvestment in their networks and attract outside capital and provide reliable service. At the same time, the board is mandated with working to ensure that effective competition exists between railroads and to maintain reasonable rates where there is a lack of effective competition. This hearing is particularly timely for me as the acting chair of the Surface Transportation Board. The board's in the process of reevaluating many of our economic regulatory practices to determine if they are still appropriate for today's environment. On May 8th, we announced that we will conduct two significant hearings. First, the board will hold a hearing on June 10th to examine whether our rate case methodologies are sufficiently accessible for grain shippers. Second, the board announced that on July 22nd and 23rd, we will explore issues pertaining to the concept of revenue adequacy. Revenue adequacy is an economic concept that describes whether a carrier is earning sufficient revenue to cover its cost and earn a reasonable return sufficient to attract capital. The ICC held that rates could be challenged if a railroad were revenue adequate over a period of years, but no corresponding methodology was ever adopted. The board also has another major proceeding that's been pending before us for some time. It involves something called competitive access or reciprocal shipping. Reciprocal switching occurs when one railroad that exclusively serves a facility agrees to provide switching services for another carrier for a flat switching fee. These reciprocal switching agreements create rail-to-rail competition by permitting a competing railroad to offer its own single-line rate, even though it cannot physically serve the shipper. The board was presented with a proposal for the increased use of reciprocal switching several years ago. I regret to say that the board has taken no action. I believe the board owes our stakeholders who have spent significant resources to develop the record in this proceeding a decision on what it plans to do with the proposal. Given the overlap between the issues raised by the competitive access proposal and the proposals raised in our grain rate and revenue adequacy proceedings, my goal after this hearing is for the board to issue a package of proposals on many, if not all, of these matters. The board is also examining our method for regulating railroad rates. It is well known that our current process, known as the standalone cost test, is cumbersome and expensive. To address concerns related to rate regulation, the board initiated two studies. First, the board engaged an independent firm to study rate reasonableness methodologies used in other industries and throughout the world. Second, the board hired a consulting firm to examine the board's internal processes for deciding rate cases. The consultant was tasked with studying our internal process and offering recommendations on how we could streamline and improve our case processing so we would be quicker and more accurate. The board is also reviewing how to handle non-rate cases to improve and speed up our decision-making. The industry is frustrated with our pace, and so am I. It's been one of my priorities since my first week at the board, and I am hopeful that this set of recommendations, including a set of performance metrics that we're putting in place, will help move the board forward more quickly. Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'll welcome questions at the end.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Dooley, you may proceed.
Well, thank you, Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Capuano, and it's a pleasure for me to be testifying today on this Staggers Act. And I represent the American Chemistry Council, and we employ about 800,000 men and women throughout this country. We are the second largest shipper of commodities by rail in the country, and it's absolutely important for us to have a strong rail industry. I want to say at the outset, there is no interest among our membership to see a re-regulation of the rail industry and go back 20 or 30 years ago. But we do feel that when we've seen what has transpired over the past, since the Staggers Act has been implemented, that we have a changed rail landscape that is resulting in a greater consolidation. And with this greater consolidation of the rail industry, it is changing the marketplace and the competitiveness of the marketplace. Because what we have seen happen, and just since I guess you go back to 2001, when you had the last major consolidation in the rail industry, we now have basically 7 Class I rail lines out there, of which 4 are responsible for 90% of all shipments. We think that also can be, you can see a correlation to that increased consolidation to what we've seen as a fairly rapid increase in the shipping rates, which have increased almost 100% since about 2001. That's also resulted in that consolidation into an increased number of shippers that are captive to one rail line. We think now that there's almost, the figures you can, are close to 75% of all shippers now in our industry are captive to one rail line. What that is resulting in is a fairly significant increase in rates and cost of shipments. We have done an analysis using AAR data and STB data, I should say, that has calculated what is the cost of shipments that exceed the 180% RVC, recoverable variable cost, that the STB uses as to consider whether or not a rate could be challenged. In the last year, that figure was about $20 billion. Now, what we're also concerned is not by the aggregate amount of that, because I'm not challenging, all those rates are certainly not unjustified. But what we are also seeing is a very rapid increase in the rates that are in excess of that 180%. In fact, we've seen a 50% increase in the rates, an increase of 300% of the RVC since 2005. So that is what is being experienced not just by our industry, but by shippers throughout the country. And that has resulted in a coalition that we have helped to organize that includes 47 other groups representing manufacturer, agriculture, and energy interests that employ about 4.7 million people and contribute $2.4 trillion in economic output. And what we're asking for is some common sense reforms to the Staggers Act and some modifications that Honorable Commissioner Miller has articulated. We think it is badly in need of reforms. So what we are suggesting is that we need to give greater attention to improving the administrative process, reforming rate bundling protections, closing rate review loopholes, allowing competitive switching, updating rate review standards, and providing arbitration as an option to streamline rate reviews. There are clearly regulatory and financial impediments to securing rate relief through STB. STB's own calculations are it costs about $5 million to bring a rate case to the STB. It takes close to 3 years before you get an outcome in that rate dispute case. That clearly is not acceptable. Now, I think that there is a way forward, and I appreciated Congressman Schuster's acknowledging the action that the Senate took that passed a bill that passed unanimously out of the Senate Commerce Committee. But what we need to do is set aside some of the hyperbolic rhetoric. And I just want to cite a statement that Ed Hamburger has in his written testimony. He said, "When one looks behind the actions that proponents of re-regulation are urging upon Congress and the STB to reform freight rail policy, it is clear that reform is a euphemism for force railroads to subsidize us, and that the needs of railroads and the general public are a distant second to their own narrow desires." Let me be very clear that the farmers, the manufacturers, the energy producers that are all part of our coalition are not narrow interests. They are in every congressional district in this country. What we are asking for is common sense reforms that have been articulated by STB commissioners. What we are asking for is common sense reforms that are advanced by the Senate. This type of rhetoric does a just disservice to shippers that are customers of the rail industry, that need a strong rail industry. It's an insult to Senators Senators Thune and Senator Nelson, who embraced the objectives that are part of the STB reforms that we are trying to advance. I hope that we can continue to work with this committee to see if we can advance similar legislation that ensures there's nothing mutually exclusive about a strong and a financially robust rail industry and giving an equitable, efficient access to a rate resolution process through the Surface Transportation Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dooley. Mr. Hamburger, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Denham, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Members DeFazio and Capuano. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. Before we turn to the issue of the Staggers Act, I'd like to associate myself with the eloquent statements of the leaders of this committee about the horrific accident outside of Philadelphia last evening. Everyone in the rail industry was saddened by what occurred last evening. Our thoughts, prayers, sympathies go out to the victims, their friends, their family. I had occasion to communicate with Joe Boardman, president of Amtrak, this morning, and he asked me to express his gratitude to the medical personnel, the firefighters, the emergency responders, all of whom were there working through the night tirelessly to try to mitigate the impact of this accident. I understand the NTSB and FRA are on the scene, as is Joe Boardman. I hope in the days and weeks to come that we will be able to learn a lesson from what happened there last evening, that we'll be able to take that lesson, as we try to do with every accident, and apply it into the future so that we can make what is already a safe industry even safer. It has, if I may turn now to the Staggers Act, it is an interesting juxtaposition to me that we are sitting here in the middle of National Infrastructure Week with pundits from across the political spectrum saying we should be spending more private money on our nation's infrastructure. On that same side of the ledger, this committee and all of Congress wrestling with where to find money for the Highway Trust Fund. And on the other side, juxtaposed with that, thanks to the Staggers Act, the freight rail industry quietly goes about its business, spending this year $29 billion, private capital, on the 140,000-mile network that is recognized as the best in the world. It is the best in the world because of a direct result of a balanced economic system at the Surface Transportation Board. It relies on competition to establish rate and service standards with a regulatory safety net available to rail customers who need it. This balanced regulation has allowed railroads to improve their financial performance from the anemic levels prior to the Staggers Act, which Chairman Miller talked about, which in turn has allowed the railroads to plow $575 billion private capital, not taxpayer money, back into the network. Class 1 railroads, as I mentioned, will spend an additional $29 billion this year. Millions of Americans work in industries that are more competitive in the tough global economy thanks to the affordability and productivity of America's freight railroads. We know that if America's future freight transportation demand is to be met, railroads must have the capacity to handle it. We are preparing for tomorrow today. All over the country, expanding intermodal terminals, double-tracking hundreds of miles of track, installing millions of new rail ties, upgrading signal systems, and building new major rail yards. These projects are aimed at maintaining and growing the railroad's network so that they are better able to serve our customers and provide the safe, efficient freight transportation service our nation's economy needs. And all of these projects are more likely to be undertaken under today's balanced regulatory system than they would have been under a system of excessive, needless regulation. This committee knows well that transportation systems are expensive to build and maintain, whether with private or public funds. Railroads are no exception. By any of a number of measures, the capital intensity of freight railroading is at or near the top of all U.S. industries. For example, this year, railroads will spend 19% of revenue on capital investment. The comparable figure for U.S. manufacturing is 3%. Looking ahead, the long-term demand for freight transportation will undoubtedly grow. With highway congestion becoming more acute and with public pressure growing to reduce emissions, conserve fuel, and promote safety, railroads are likely to be called upon to do even more in the years ahead. And as our economy evolves, we will be called upon to make additional investments. For that to happen, there must be appropriate public policies in place. Policymakers should acknowledge that for reasons of international competitiveness, safety, and economic growth, the United States has a critical and growing need for investment in transportation infrastructure. Private rail investment should be encouraged, and regulations and legislation should not adversely affect railroads' ability or willingness to make those investments. And I want to thank the committee for its bipartisan letter last year to the STB explicitly acknowledging those facts, dated March 14, 2014, which I'd asked to be made part of the record. Today, our nation faces a number of serious transportation-related problems, many of which this committee, to its credit, is working hard to address. I submit to you that it makes no sense to add to that list by trying to fix something that is not broken. The current rail regulatory system is working well, and because of that, our nation's freight rail network is working well, too. I'll just add at the end, with respect to the bill that came out of committee in March from the Senate Commerce Committee, our industry did not object to that bill, and I expect that it will be moving through the Senate and on its way to the House sometime this year. Thank you for the opportunity. Sorry I went a little over, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your allowing me to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. Ms. Darr, let me proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Denham, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Members Capuano and DeFazio, and members of the committee. In wake of last night's Amtrak accidents, I also wanted to extend the condolences of all those in the short line industry to those that lost their lives, those that are in the hospital, and the family and friends that grieve for them. I am Linda Darr. I'm president of the Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. We are the little association that could. ASLRRA is a national trade organization representing the nation's 550 Class II and Class III railroads. Together, the short line railroads operate nearly 38% of the national rail network. We handle in origination or destination 1 out of every 4 rail cars moving on the national system. The Staggers Act saved the rail industry from collapse, and in many respects, it's the parent of the short line industry. The economic freedoms and the regulatory flexibility embodied in the Act allowed the railroads to save light-density branch lines rather than abandon them. As a result, short lines have grown from 8,000 miles of track in 1980 to 50,000 miles today. We operate in 49 states. In 5 states, short lines operate 100% of the state's total rail network. In 10 states, we operate more than 50%, and in 30 states, we operate at least 1/4 of the rail network. In creating the modern-day short line industry, the Staggers Act ensured that huge areas of rural and small-town America would stay connected to the national network. For the small businesses and the farmers in those areas, our ability to take a 25-car train 50 miles to the nearest Class I creates the critical link that allows rail to be their choice for shipping. The Staggers Act jump-started today's short line industry, but short lines took hold of that opportunity, and short lines made it work. The industry was formed by entrepreneurs who took large financial risks to purchase and rehabilitate light-density lines. Most borrowed heavily from the bank and contributed substantial amounts of their personal capital to make these new ventures work. They are aggressive marketers that fight as hard for single carload business as they do for unit trains. And that fight for business keeps transportation costs as competitive as possible, which is good for our customers and ultimately for the nation's consumers. Short lines have worked hard on building relationships with their customers. Many of those customers were our partners in helping save even the most marginal lines. They did so by helping finance rehabilitation through realistic rates and by agreeing to meaningful traffic volumes. Today, our customers are the beneficiaries of our success. Short lines reinvest on average as much as 30% of annual gross revenues in repairing and upgrading our infrastructure. This is a huge percentage of what we earn, and it is evidence of our real drive to succeed. That investment has been supplemented by important help from Congress in the form of the 45G rehabilitation tax credit, which allows us to invest more of what we earn in improving our infrastructure. We're grateful to the members of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee who have been enormously helpful in shepherding this legislation. This has been the most consequential piece of railroad legislation for the short line industry since the Staggers Act, responsible for leveraging over $1.5 billion in short line capital investment. Capital investment in railroads is not only about economic growth and jobs, it is also about safety. Every dollar we invest in track rehabilitation makes our tracks safer. The leading cause of train derailments are track-related, and the better our track, the safer our railroads. We also know that improving safety requires building a strong safety culture on every short line property. To that end, the Short Line Association has partnered with the Congress and the FRA to establish a Short Line Rail Safety Institute to assess the safety practices and the safety culture of individual short lines and to provide support to improve workplace safety. Track rehabilitation and a strong safety culture are what we need to take the progress we've made under Staggers and make the short line story viable for the long term. Let me conclude with an anecdote that tells the short line story post-Staggers as concisely as anything I've said here today. In 1983, 3 years after Staggers was passed, Dick Webb, the father of Watco's current CEO, was a unionized car repairman at the Kansas City Southern. He took out a $25,000 bank loan to begin a rail switching operation in DeRidder, Louisiana, which began Watco Companies. Today, Watco operates 4,600 miles of short line track, employs 3,600 people, and moves over 1 million carloads annually across track that was surely headed for abandonment. Hundreds of short lines across the country can repeat some version of that story. It's a great American success story, and it was made possible in no small measure by the Staggers Act. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Darr. Mr. Mayo, you recognize.
Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, members of the committee. My name is John Mayo. I'm a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. For 30 years, I have studied the economics of regulation and deregulation in the American economy in a variety of industries, including electricity, telecommunications, cable television, pharmaceuticals, the internet, as well as the domestic freight rail industry. A summary of my publications and relevant experience is included as an attachment to my testimony. In 1980, the Staggers Act passed Congress in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. It was signed and enthusiastically endorsed by President Carter. This act fundamentally altered the governance structure of the rail industry, shifting from a highly granular model of regulation to a model in which markets, rather than regulators and rate bureaus, are largely responsible for establishing prices and investment. Importantly, this legislation was not driven by simple ideology. It did not embrace deregulation out of a belief that markets are always superior to government. Neither at the time of the passage of the Act did ideologues argue that steps to free railroads from regulatory constraints should be halted out of a fear that railroads would necessarily harm the public interest. Rather, the deregulatory measures adopted in Staggers were embraced for a simple and profound reason. Deregulatory steps in the industry were, as a practical matter, not an ideological matter, but a practical matter, being revealed to produce superior economic outcomes for the industry and for the economy more generally. Legislators from both political parties, economists, and industry observers at the time were all very optimistic about the potential for improved rail performance under the Staggers Act. Of course, optimism on the front end of any legislation is very normal. The real question is how have economic outcomes evolved for consumers, for producers, and for the American economy as a whole in the wake of Staggers. Fortunately, we now have 35 years of experience with Staggers, and I can tell you with considerable confidence that the governance structure of the Act has been significantly and substantially successful. This was recognized in Congress in 1995 when the Senate Commerce Committee declared, quote, "The Staggers Act is considered the most successful rail transportation legislation ever produced, resulting in the restoration of the financial health of the rail industry," end quote. Consequently, with President Clinton's support, Congress took the additional step of further easing regulatory constraints by eliminating the Interstate Commerce Commission, replacing it with the current Surface Transportation Board. Importantly, the bill transferred authority to the STB, carefully avoiding alteration of the fundamental premises of the Staggers Act. With the benefits of an additional 25 years now of observation, or 20 years since the observation of the 1995 congressional blessing of the Staggers Act, it is now possible to look afresh at whether the Act is succeeding in promoting a safe and efficient rail transportation system as is called for in the Act. Economic signals of efficiency include increased output, the breadth and utility of service offerings, reduced cost, and indications of consumer value. And of course, as with all transportation modes, safety is generally thought of as being measured by or gauged by the severity and frequency of casualties. While a detailed discussion of these economic metrics is beyond the time permitted by my oral testimony, I have taken the liberty of attaching a recent study that I co-authored with Professors Jeffrey Macker and Lee Pinkwitz, also of Georgetown University, that examines in detail the economic metrics associated with this industry. We find, as numerous other scholars have, that the liberalizations introduced by Staggers and their subsequent implementation have produced a variety of positive economic indicators and consequences for the industry, for consumers, and for the economy as a whole. We also identify areas of vulnerability as the future of rail policymaking unfolds. Of particular concern is the prospect that the emerging successes in the industry may be co-opted by the imposition of earnings regulation in the industry. These concerns are discussed in detail in the research article that is appended to my testimony. Thank you very much for your time and attention this morning. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayo. I'm going to deviate from this morning's schedule just slightly in light of last night's horrific accident and recognize Mr. DeFazio for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you for the courtesy, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to deviate from my prepared remarks for a few moments here in light of the horrific accident last evening where 6 people lost their lives and more than 140 were injured. Our hearts and prayers go out to the family and friends of those involved and hope for a speedy recovery of those who are injured. We obviously don't know the cause at this point. We always depend upon the good works of the NTSB to bring that result to us, and I look forward to learning and finding out what we can do to mitigate or prevent future accidents. We do know a little. It was a shared section of track, so that's the beginnings of understanding where and how these things happen, but we don't know much else at this point. However, I will observe, I find it very, very ironic that as we sit here, over there somewhere, wherever the appropriations lords sit, they are proposing to cut $290 million from the Amtrak Capital Grants program. I would say that that program is already somewhat insufficient since Amtrak has a $21 billion state of good repair backlog. And, you know, it's deteriorating every year, and at the current level of investment, if the appropriators don't cut it, it'll take about 25 or 30 years to get it up to a state of good repair, and that doesn't deal with some other major projects that would facilitate rail movement, let alone make it safer and in a state of good repair. So I would hope that our friends on the Appropriations Committee are cognizant of the real world out there, of what happened last night, of what the capital needs of Amtrak are, and will not engage in a short-sighted budget cutting in an area where we already have a $21 billion backlog. There were two issues, and I will submit my full testimony for the full opening statement for the record, that I really wanted to focus on: short-line investments and tariffs, or the potential for tariffs for transporting dangerous products. We've heard from the rail industry about the investments they're making, and they shouldn't have to divert from basic investments that they need to be making in capacity and safety, including positive train control, which we mandated, to deal with concerns or problems caused by shipments of hazardous materials and others. There was one particular case that got my attention, Powder River Basin coal, where the company was refusing to put a surfactant on it. The dust was coming out. It was getting into the ballast and destabilizing the rail bed. So since the company was refusing to deal with that, they were taken by BNSF BNSF decided to charge an additional tariff. They lost that judgment, even though the STB found that coal dust did propose a danger for the ballast and the rail stability, that they couldn't charge that differential tariff. I think we need to re-examine that principle and our directives to them in light of the current shipments. I mean, if we could send a market signal, we'd see probably a lot less chlorine being sent on rail, because there are substitutes for unbelievably toxic chlorine, which would cause much more damage in an urban area potentially than oil. There are problems with oil, et cetera. I hope we'll look at that. And secondly, short-line railroads. We had an FRA report on the capital needs, and they found that although holding companies are able to attract some capital, that the total overall investment needs are about $6.9 billion that are unmet. And I would hope we can find ways to work with the short line railroads to accomplish those necessary investments, because they are critical to areas like my Port of Coos Bay and other areas. So with that, I would yield back to balance my time. I thank the chairman for his courtesy, and I apologize that I'm going to have to go meet with a bunch of mayors pretty soon and leave.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. The first question I have, Mr. Mayo, given the history of railroads and the Staggers Act, what is the appropriate role of regulation in this marketplace currently?
From an economic perspective, the role of regulation in general is to correct market failures, where the cost of correcting that failure is less than the damage done by the market failure itself. Now, if we turn to the Staggers Act and to the rail industry itself, I think the place that I would start, if I were you, is right at the very outset of Staggers. There's a set of congressional findings, so legislative findings, that number one, that transportation services are, generally speaking, provided under conditions of competition. And number two, that in light of that competition and the general absence of market failures, that unnecessary and inefficient regulations should be removed. Now, the Staggers Act did that. The Staggers Act peeled away a number of regulations that were deemed to be unnecessary and inefficient. In your situation now and today at the hearing, what you're trying to do is say, how'd that work out for us? as a nation. And I think the good news for you is that it's worked out quite well on the economic metrics. Prices are lower than they were in 1980. Output is massively higher than it was in 1980. The quality of services is higher than it was. Investment has been very robust. Innovation has been very high. And safety is generally improved. On any number of metrics, it's worked out pretty well. So what I would say is that in terms of regulatory and legislative oversight, let's call it a light touch regulatory approach has been very, very successful. It doesn't mean that there can't occasionally be market failures that warrant intervention. It doesn't mean that we ought not to have regulatory oversight. When market failures do occur, regulators should be vigilant and move decisively. But by and large, the light touch approach has worked very well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayo. Ms. Miller, we've heard from shippers quite often about the access to rate cases as well as the cost of rate cases. And as I understand, STB has taken a look at several different steps to enhance the accessibility to some of these smaller shippers and medium-sized shippers. Can you explain some of the actions that STB has taken and whether or not that is improving that access?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to address that. The board, over a period of time, has taken a look at ways that they can improve access to our processes for smaller shippers. We put in place something that's called the simplified SAC approach. We also have something we call the 3 benchmark test. What we've discovered, though, is that few shippers have found those approaches to be beneficial to them. And while we've had a few rate cases filed under our streamlined methodologies, it hasn't had the impact we had hoped that it would have. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board. We have gone back to the drawing board. We need to look for additional ways that we can make our processes more accessible and easier for shippers. One example of that would be the hearing that we're going to have in June, which is for grain shippers. You know, there has not been a grain rate case filed since 1981. Some might conclude that's because grain rates are quite appropriate, so there's no need for a rate case. Certainly when agricultural groups come in to meet with me, that is not their view. They do feel that the processes before the board simply don't suit their needs. So we need to do some work, see if we can't find some better approaches to come back and present to our shippers and see if we can't make our processes more accessible and more useful.
Thank you. And Mr. Dooley, have you utilized these new provisions that have been put in place by STB? Are they working?
In terms of the new provisions, our industry, in terms of the simplified SAC or the 3 benchmark, I don't think there's any of our member companies that have used that, in part because of the caps on awards that you can secure there. Doesn't justify the cost of expense. I think Commissioner Miller would state, too, is that...
Caps meaning that they're too high and it becomes too expensive for the smaller shippers?
Yes. I mean, it's, yeah, you still, on a SAC, simplified SAC, it still could be a $3 to $4 million investment. And then you have a limited ability in terms of what you could be rewarded if you prevailed. That doesn't justify it. Well, on the standalone cost SAC, is that, you know, we had 2 member companies, Olin and DuPont, that invested, you know, in excess of $5 million each and brought cases which both were turned down. And they were turned down because, in large part, because they were required to develop their own theoretic railroad, a SAR, a standalone railroad. And that process is so cumbersome and expensive. And, you know, we're not in the business of that. And I just read a statement that Commissioner Begman had in regards to the DuPont case. And she stated, "I was struck by the level of detail that must be considered to design a SAR and the high burden it places on both parties, but especially for the shipper who lacks familiarity with constructing and running a railroad. I'm concerned in that some instances the task of designing a winning SAR, so the shipper would prevail, can be so burdensome that a single error by the shipper in the design of the SAR can be fatal." This is a clear example of the regulatory problems we face. And she also stated in another case, the board has a duty to ensure that shippers have a viable means to challenge a rate. I already know that it is not the case for green shippers, and the board should ask whether the SAC process can provide a meaningful gauge, a rate reasonable for carload traffic shippers. And I think that's consistent with Commissioner Miller's commitment to continue working on this. It's also consistent with the legislation that passed the Senate Commerce Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Doolin. My time's expired. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Lipinski.
Take me a second here. Wasn't expecting to be next, but thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. It'd be an understatement to say the Staggers Act has saved the railroad industry, since it really saved our freight system, as well as preserving thousands of miles of track for goods movement. And as others have said, I've been to Europe, I've been to Asia, and they talk about our freight rail system as the envy of the world. And I certainly think that the Staggers Act has, played a very important role. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that every railroad has been a good actor and that there haven't been some problems for local communities and sometimes for shippers. In many instances, we've seen freight railroads do the right thing and work with local communities beyond federal regulations, obviating the need to expand regulations. I certainly applaud these efforts, and I've been pleased to work with Norfolk Southern, CSX, BNSF, and Union Pacific on CREATE in northeastern Illinois. Also working with the railroads and Metra on commuter rail and other issues. But I have concerns that not all of Class 1 railroads are holding up their end of the bargain as community members. And I hate to raise this publicly, but I feel the need to do that here. There's one railroad that I won't name, but I think people will find it easy to figure out. I've had a few issues with. This railroad refused requests to slow its trains as they passed close to a local annual weekend-long festival, so that's just a couple days a year, that featured a children's carnival. I've joined this town in asking for cooperation this year and have yet to hear anything 1 month before the event. I've also asked this railroad to work with commuter rail to add more service, and nothing has moved forward after many years of working on this. I've also heard some complaints from shippers. Now, I'm not asking for more federal regulations. I think that's the last place that we want to go, and only if it's absolutely necessary to do. But I'm wondering what can be done. I wanted to ask Chairwoman Miller and Mr. Hamburger if he has any comments to add. What can be done to encourage any bad actors to change their behavior? How do we get everyone on the same page? What can are there options for the STB? Chairwoman Miller?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. It's certainly one I spend some time thinking about. We have a minimal number of regulatory tools available to us at the Surface Transportation Board. Truthfully, I don't think that regulatory tools really is what would be useful in this situation. As the professors pointed out, the rolling back of regulation really has had a profound effect in terms of allowing the freight transportation industry in the United States to really blossom, and we need to be mindful of that. I know from my own experience in the year that I've been at the board, fairly aggressively reaching out to both shippers and railroads, doing a fair amount of traveling, that there are certainly frustrations out there on the part of both shippers and communities at times when they feel that the railroads have not been responsive to their concerns. By the same token, I've seen amazing things that are happening on the rail systems in terms of the way that they're improving their processes and becoming more and more productive, and we want to keep that going as well. I think one thing that the board can do, I think we need to be cognizant of providing opportunities, is to be a sounding board, a place where people can come when they have concerns, a place where problems can be aired, and we can try to find opportunities to get both shippers, communities, and the railroads to work together to solve them. And I think that the board's presence, just the very fact that we are present and at times can bring both parties in for discussions, has been helpful, and I'd like to look for more opportunities to do those things.
Thank you.
Ms. Lipinski, thank you for that question. I'd be glad to meet with you offline to get the specifics of this particular case. I would like to point out, however, that all of my members, all of the AR members, have taken voluntary steps to improve safety, whether it is speed limits, increased track inspections, reaching out to their communities, emergency responders, making sure that they are trained for dealing with an incident if a hazardous material incident does occur. So while I understand your frustration at this particular incident, I guess I would take exception with your saying that one of the class ones is a, quote, bad actor. I think they are all committed to working with the communities in which they operate and operating at a safe level. But I'll be glad to come by and discuss the details of your specific situation.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I had other questions I won't be able to get to on reciprocal switching. If we don't have a chance to come back for more questions, I'll do a question for the record. So you go back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Schuster.
Thank you very much. My question concerns as I mentioned in my opening statement, the Senate Commerce's STB bill. I'm very interested in hearing your views, and could you be concise as to what you may have concerns in it or what you like about it? But if you could be concise, I'll start with Ms. Darr.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster. We are generally supportive. We especially like the provision that allows the board members to talk to one another. We think that that is just good common sense. And we also support the idea of it being an independent agency.
Any concerns in it that, in general, you're okay with it?
We're okay with it.
Mr. Hamburger said he didn't object to it. I don't know.
We did not object to it. I think that the bill does provide for voluntary arbitration. I would point out that the board itself set up a voluntary arbitration program 1 or 2 years ago, I believe, whereby a shipper or a railroad would sign up and say, I hereby agree that arbitration can be used for a case to be brought against me. And of all the shippers, not one has signed up. One Class 1 railroad has. So I just find it interesting that is the case. But with respect to the committee's action, again, we have no objection.
And Mr. Dooley?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off with the arbitration issue. Is that there is an improvement in the arbitration process in the Senate bill. Ed referred to the existing arbitration that no shipper has utilized is because there really is no real value to it. It doesn't specifically allow for the consideration and arbitration of rates.
Do you think this bill addresses that? So
it does.
You would anticipate some of your members signing up?
And it does have a cap of damage or cap on awards of $200,000, which you're talking in the shipper community is not worth the effort. In the Thune proposal, they increase that to $25 million. And so you will see a lot more interest in the participation in this, and it'll be interesting to see if the rail industry will agree to it. The other issue I say that we're very appreciative that is included in the Thune bill, and it gets to Congressman Lipinski's, is the issue of reciprocal shipping. And we appreciate the work that the Commission is continuing to do on that. But if you look at this and why this is an increasingly important issue when you have the consolidation of the rail industry, is that right now, if you were shipping, say, from Chicago to Long Beach, the port of Long Beach, and you have two different rail lines there, you have two competitive opportunities in terms of pricing your shipment. But if you are shipping through a short haul or through a Class 1 railroad into Chicago, today you can't get a rate from that point A to Chicago and then from Chicago to Long Beach. And this doesn't allow for the marketplace to work and give you the access. What we are hopeful is that with the inclusion in the Senate bill of consideration of reciprocal shipping is that we can see a way where we can get a rate quoted from point A to Chicago. We would be willing to pay the cost of that transfer, and then we would have the ability to have the more competitive marketplace from Chicago to Los Angeles or Long Beach.
Mr. Chairman, if I might correct Mr. Dooley for the record.
Briefly.
Last year's bill that was reported in September had a specific provision directing the board to proceed on the Knit League proposal. That provision is not part of the bill that was reported out at the end of March. I believe there is a great deal of inference that the board should draw from the fact that this year's bill is not directing them.
Okay, I got the point. Ms. Miller, what are your thoughts on the Senate Commerce SDB?
Well, I think as the regulators, we didn't necessarily take a position saying we supported it or had problems with it, but generally speaking, we found it to be a very balanced bill that I think will provide some advantages to the board and will allow the board to do its job in a better way. And generally speaking, we think it's a good bill that will be advantageous.
And Mr. Dooley, instead of you responding here, I would rather the two of you come see me and let's talk about this issue so that I fully understand. Okay, go ahead.
This only has, Ed was right on, it doesn't have a specific requirement. It has a specific requirement that SB concludes their consideration of reciprocal shipping and come to a decision.
And I just like, you made a comment about Mr. Hamburger's saying narrow interest. Well, I don't know about narrow interest, but I know about self-interest. And I've seen the railroads and I've seen the different industries, yours also, driven by self-interest. I understand that. That's what keeps us all straight. Self-interest up here, as the Founding Fathers said, that's the critical issue that's going to keep us all in line. But I just want to make sure that, captive shippers, I've had testimony after testimony. I ask a question, who's building facilities? Mines, of course, are where mines are, and the agriculture industry is kind of where it is. But I know that there are manufacturers that actually build facilities to be captive shippers along rail lines. And several years ago, there were one railroad. There were 48 different companies making themselves captive shippers. So again, when we're talking about that captive shipper issue, that's something I'm always focused on to say who does this to themselves. And I also like to add, I have a place in western Pennsylvania that has connections to 3 Class I railroads, and I've yet to have a big manufacturer come and locate there when they talk about captive shipping. So again, that's something I'm very interested in. If some of your companies are doing that to themselves, well, I mean, they must be there for a reason. It must be the railroads are providing something that they want. And so, again, that's something very concerning. And the other final issue, if I could, Mr. Denham, on the issue of natural gas, I think you guys have taken the right position, but some of your members don't want to export natural gas because that will possibly drive up their costs. And once again, I know that's self-interest. But my self-interest is we got a tremendous amount of gas in Pennsylvania, and we want to share it with the world. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I enjoy watching the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight between you two. Let me just say first that my heart goes out to the victims last night, and I hope that it's a speedy recovery for the people that are hurt and that determine quickly what happens so we can address it. I represent the northern part of New Jersey, which is very congested. I represent the ports. And there have been a number of investments over the years between the railroads and obviously the Port Authority. But I was just wondering what what policies can the STB and the Congress put in place to continue and maximize the investment into the infrastructure of the railroads? Because in my district, it's very important. What policies can we put? Can we help out with? Mr. Hamburg, we want to.
Thank you, Congressman Series. As I tried to point out in my written testimony, there is a direct correlation between the amount of money that railroads can put back into the infrastructure and the amount of money that they can make in the private sector. Direct correlation, which is why we've been able to put $575 billion back in since 1980, $29 billion this year, $26 billion last year. As the Congressional Budget Office has observed, profits are both the means and the motive for reinvestment. You have to have an ability to have that revenue to reinvest, and you have to have the expectation that that investment will pay a return. And that means you have to have a balanced economic regulatory system, which I think the board currently enjoys. I believe that there are process changes that can be made. Commend the board for the 3B, the 3 benchmark approach, the simplified SAC. I believe they've increased the amount of money that can be recovered under that. The authority that they're going to get from the Senate Commerce Bill, should that come into play. So I think there are process changes that can be made, but that the underlying basic economic approaches Dr. Mayo has pointed out is working, and I think going forward it should be continued.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, I don't know if you've discussed this before, but can you just discuss some of the major proceedings that have been pending before the STB board? And what challenges does the STB face in resolving some of these proceedings in a timely fashion?
Well, let me say a couple of things. One, I was surprised when I got to the board to discover how many decisions, in fact, pass across the board. So we tend to focus a lot of our attention on the rate cases, which take years, cost millions of dollars. But in fact, day to day, there's so much more work that's going on at the board. So I think, one, it's just good to have that as a reference point, that there are other things that are happening in a very timely way. I would say a couple of issues related to the board's ability to move more quickly and do its work in what I would consider to be sort of a better process. One, I want to take the opportunity, and I'm most sincere when I say this, to say that one of my biggest surprises when I came to the board was to discover that, we have virtually a third world computer system, which is so arcane and outdated that we just cannot get on top of solving our problems. Our website regularly goes down. Our practitioners can't get access to our information. We have massive problems with it and have very little budget to deal with it. One of my highest priorities is fixing our computer system, but it's hard to do it when you don't have a capital budget to fix it. It is a serious issue. Secondly, we have process problems that we can and should solve ourselves. When I look at what I would consider the process for how the board deals with rate cases, it is not a rigorous enough process. We are not creating deadlines, and we are not then being disciplined in terms of meeting what deadlines are set. I think that's something we can solve ourselves and that we need to do. One of my first questions when I came to the board was to ask, what are the performance metrics that we use in order to monitor the board's own performance? And was met with surprised looks because people didn't even know what I was talking about. So one of the things we're doing is to develop a set of metrics. Are we, in fact, meeting goals we should be setting for ourselves in terms of how we are doing our work? I think those things will be hugely beneficial in terms of not just improving how we function as a board, but quite frankly, better serving the shippers who come to us and better serving the railroads, and I think they're very important. I would want to say one other thing. The Senate 808 gives greater authority for the board members to speak with each other. I think that that would be very helpful, but I also think that the board's been quite conservative in how it's looked at those issues. It's been quite conservative in how it deals with ex parte communications. Far too often, the board is making decisions based simply on a written record. And I don't know about any of you. I just know that if all I'm doing is reading a record that has been written by attorneys, I am not going to fully understand an issue in a way which will allow me to make a good, on-the-ground, practical decision. And I think it's extremely important that we open up our processes. I feel like many of our board employees are much too isolated from the industries that we're regulating, and so I want to open that up as well. And I think that we can do that in a responsible way that will, in significant ways, improve our decision-making process.
My time has run out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Series. Mr. Hanna.
Mr. Mayo, Mr. Hamburger rightly points out that they invested billions and billions of dollars, $29 billion recently. Mr. Dooley would argue that a disproportionate amount of that comes out of his pocket because of the captive shipping, the limited competition, et cetera. The 180% benchmark for the RVC ratio would also, Mr. Dooley would argue that the appeal process is difficult, cumbersome, and frankly just not worth it. As someone I assume is more independent here than others and less vested, what do you think of all that, Mr. Mayo?
Two things. One, the data speak pretty clearly to the issue of investment. As I described it, the light touch regulatory approach has been swimmingly successful. A number of $29 billion of investment this year was used. That's just a fact, and that's an intense level of investment. And that bodes very well not only for current consumers, but for future consumers.
But speak to the issue that Mr. Dooley's talking about. I mean, no one's going to argue that it's a wonderful thing to invest that money. The argument that I hear, and I'm trying to understand better, is the disproportionate because of the lack of captive lines and allegations.
So that brings me to the second issue, which is that how is the investment going to play out for consumers? And there's a regulatory process in place to ensure that rates at the end of the day are reasonable. The STB oversees that regulatory process. If rates aren't reasonable, then the STB can and should step in. But by and large, what you've seen over the last 30 years is that prices have fallen. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, prices are lower now than they were even in 19...
That still doesn't speak to the 180% RVC benchmark, what you're saying right now. Because that hasn't changed.
That benchmark has not changed, and I'm not advocating that it should change. That change was part of Staggers. Some rates are below that 180 benchmark, some are above the 180 benchmark, and the STB has a process, now a three-part process for allowing consumers, shippers, to come to the STB and make a case that those rates, if they lie above 180, are unreasonable. In the event that the firm is that there is a captive shipper and that the rates are judged to be unreasonable, there's a mechanism in place.
But I also hear you saying that on a weighted average basis, it sort of works out.
It's more than worked out. Prices, as I mentioned, on average are considerably below where they were in 1980.
Mr. Dooley, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I guess, first off, I think the 47 associations representing, again, the farmers, manufacturers, energy producers, we don't want to go back. I mean, Staggers Act's been a major improvement in terms of creating a robust rail industry, and we want that to continue. What we're asking for is something, it's not like we're paying a disproportionate share. I wouldn't even go as far to say that's our complaint. Our complaint as shippers is that we do not have access to an efficient and an equitable rate resolution process.
Are you all right with the Senate bill then?
We think the Senate bill takes a step in the right direction. It doesn't prescribe any specific outcomes. It really drives the STB to conclude some of their issues that they currently have under review that we think, whether it's, the standalone cost methodology that they're...
Mr. Hamburger, I got about a minute here.
Well, I'd like to associate myself with Chairwoman Miller when she opened in her opening statement. I wrote it down: quicker and more accurate. That is what we need at the board. We need quicker, but that needs to be balanced with more accurate. Some of these rate cases have $200-300 million in the balance, so you don't want that done on a coin flip. You want it done quickly, but it has to be accurate, and that's why it takes some time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, Ms. Napolitano is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have a couple of interesting observations. Ms. Miller, you indicate your computer. That goes to the issue of being able to have enough adequate staffing to investigate complaints. Do you have them?
One of the things that the Senate bill does is provides the board with investigatory authority. Currently, we are a complaint-driven board, so we don't initiate any complaints or any investigations. We just respond if a complaint's been brought to us. In the Senate 808, one of the things it would do is provide us with investigatory authority, and so we certainly would need additional
How about funding
staffing.
for the computer change?
Pardon me?
Computers. You say you have outdated computers.
Right. And you're asking if we have the staffing resources to improve our computer systems?
And to do a new system of computers.
I think that we have the staff to do it. What we really need still is hardware and software updating. So it's not a staffing problem as much as it's a hardware-software problem that needs to be updated.
Which leads me to the other question. My understanding is the board has supposed to have 3 members, only 2 are appointed. And
That's
there's
correct.
asking for an increase to 5. Would that have an impact?
I think, and Mr. Dooley and others could perhaps address this better, I think some of our practitioners have felt that the board is handicapped by having 3 members because no 2 members can have a conversation on any topic before the board. And if we had 5 members, then at least 2 members would have the ability to talk with each other. I think that would be extremely
Anybody else?
helpful, but I think we can also improve it by opening up our ex parte communications.
Agree?
Yes, I would agree, is that, we think that STB needs to be a more efficiently operating organization. We think the expansion of the number of commissioners would be, a partial solution to that. But also, I think we're seeing the evolution of the focus of STB, is that they did help to get the rail industry back on track.
Okay.
But now we are moving into an area where this increased consolidation, their focus needs to increasingly shift to ensuring that there is competition in the marketplace.
Okay, Mr. Dooley, you hit on another point that some of my shippers have brought to my attention, is that's overcharging. You want to address that?
Well, and that gets back to the fundamental issue I think that shippers are most interested in, is that having access to, or eliminating some of the regulatory and financial impediments to having access to a rate resolution process. It is, it's not acceptable that a shipper has to commit to paying $5 million about.
And 3 to 4 years for resolution?
In 3 or 4 years. So let's find a way that we can fix that, which
But
I
what
think,
will be? What is your recommendation?
Well,
What would help?
I think that part of it is reevaluating some of the policies that were put in place 35 years ago. I mean, the whole issue of revenue adequacy, that was a relevant issue. I mean, a very relevant issue back 35 years ago.
Yeah.
But I attest, Warren Buffett doesn't make investments in companies that are not revenue adequate. And we need to be evaluating how that is used and calculated in resolving rate disputes.
Another area of great concern is we've gone through and talked to public safety. There's railroad safety, safety of our grade separations. As you know, I'm key on grade separations because of the Element Quarter East.
Absolutely.
And the safety of anything that comes out of the ports for on-time delivery to the Eastern Seaboard. So I'm just wondering how much of that is going to be continued to be able to address the different aspects of the infrastructure change, whether it's the ties, whether it's the rails, whether it's your locomotives, greener. What is it that is going to affect us?
Well, of course, that's all of that is where the $29 billion I keep referring to goes, to millions of new ties, new rail, stronger gauge rail, Tier 4 locomotives that are the newest, cleanest locomotives out there are now being bought. But if I could go back to your previous question for just a quick second, where you talked about overcharging, I would just like to put in the record, I think it may be in my written statement, but I'd like to draw your attention to it, that the average inflation-adjusted freight rail rates for all commodities are about where they were in 1991. And for Mr. Dooley's members, it's where they were in 1988. So where there is, quote, overcharging, that's what the board is there for, and I've expressed our support for quicker but more accurate processes. But I would just like to get on the record that the rates being charged today are where they were in 1991, 1988 for chemical companies.
Well, is there a way to be able to, and I'll just leave this for the record, to be able to ensure that the complaints received will be resolved in a faster, more expedient manner? The complaints?
Yes, I think that there is, and I think we're working on that to improve our processes so that we can ensure that that happens. I would want to say, as I said before, we get very focused on these rate cases because, as Mr. Hamburger pointed out, sometimes we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that are at stake. So they're very important. They take a lot of our staff time. But every day, every month, decisions are going through our agency that are handled very quickly and are allowing businesses to get back to doing what they need to do.
Thank you to the witnesses, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. With that, Congressman Rokita, recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Good morning, gang. Appreciate you being here. And I appreciate the passion I see in each one of you for the industries that you regulate or are in. I do think you're part of America's 21st century future. So again, thanks for being here. I'll start with Ms. Dar. We have a lot of short-range railroads in Indiana, or a lot for us. We seem to like them. General question for you. What is the overall economic outlook for the U.S. short-line railroad industry and the future demand for rail transportation? And in your view, what role should Ms. Miller's agency play to ensure that the U.S. freight rail system can continue to grow, especially with regard to the short lines?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Rokita. I would say, first of all, short lines love Indiana, so I think it's a reciprocal relationship.
We love you. Don't tell CSX.
In regard to your answer about the economic outlook, I believe it's strong, but that doesn't mean that we can just go along a path and not interject along the way and assume that it's going to remain strong. We have invested in our infrastructure. We've been able to do that through the 45G program, and as I indicated in my testimony, that's not just about economic development. That's also about safety. Making sure that our infrastructure is safe is critical for our growth. Staggers got us this far. Going forward, 45G is going to be absolutely essential to our ability to rehabilitate our track. And I also think that we've done an excellent job of attracting new customers. Short lines have developed a reputation within the industry as being very customer friendly. You have not seen me get into any negative discussion with Mr. Dooley, and I can assure you that all of his members would be thrilled with the short line performance that they've received to date, and I won't let Mr. Dooley take on any conversation about that except outside of the room. And then I think also an important part of our growth is the good partnership that we've established with the Class 1s. I think that's demonstrated by the work that we're doing with AAR and Mr. Hamburger here. That's going to be very critical. We rely on them for a lot of our business, and they rely on us to bring the customer to them as well. So it's an important relationship. In regard to what Chairwoman Miller can do in regard to changes in the SCB to help us out, it's speed and expedited rulings, and I think, as Ed said, the speed can't happen without accuracy. Both of those things are absolutely critical. And in relation to what we're talking about today, don't roll back Staggers. Anything that rolls back the Staggers Act is going to put us in a position, as Chairman Denham had said earlier, of being hammered by burdensome regulations, and as in the past, that was putting us in a position where we were dying a slow death, and we can't go there again.
Thank you. And on that, Mr. Hamburger and Mr. Dooley would agree, correct? All in line on that, with that last statement?
I certainly would, yes.
Yeah, okay. Let the record reflect they're answering in the affirmative. And Mr. Dooley has a footnote.
We certainly do not want to see the Staggers Act eliminated, but we think that there could be some modifications that, again, give us more equitable access to a rate resolution process.
Okay. And at the risk of not getting to you, Mr. Mayor, I need to go to the chairwoman, and I want to first thank you for sitting in the chair as you do and actually articulating the fact that you have a strategic plan with goals and rates set to them and that kind of thing inside your office. I think that goes without saying, quite frankly, when you have agencies as big as yours and others that are much bigger. Yet many who sit in that chair don't bring any of that information to us. I am puzzled that your testimony seems to focus on the fact that you don't have a computer system or your technology is behind and this and that. And are you trying to tell me that the appropriations has that much control and micromanages your budget that well that you couldn't fire a non-performing employee or 2 or 10 or 20 or 100 and get the computer money you need so that you can expedite these cases with a bit more accuracy?
Well, in terms overall, just very quickly, we are actually quite a small agency, about 140 people, and the way that we've created any of the funding necessary to try to make improvements to it is by holding positions open and not filling them. Otherwise, we just don't have any kind of a capital budget at all, so we've got nothing to turn to absent that. I think one of the things that you're seeing is that while I am a firm believer that, you don't start by saying we need more people to accomplish your job. You start by saying, what can we be doing differently to get our jobs done? I've been at the board for a year. I could not say that we are overstaffed. I would not draw that conclusion at all. And in fact, there are some real gaps, I think, in skill sets at the boards that we need to be better able to serve both the railroads
You
and
don't
the
have
shippers that
one
come to us.
non-performing worker that you wish you could under the law
Oh,
of fire?
yes, I sure do.
Oh, okay.
And I have to say, I've come from state government. It's where I've worked my whole life, not the
Can you
federal
tell I
system.
came from state government?
And I would tell you that I've found many more ways at the state system to take care of non-performing employees than I've been able to uncover at the
Maybe
federal
we should work
system.
together and find a way to get those ideas here.
But I do want to go back to say quickly, because I don't want to leave anybody with a false impression. We are working very hard to solve our own problems, but I have to say we have very few tools to do it, and I use this as an opportunity today because I feel so strongly about it. We want to do a better job for these guys, but we need some tools, and you just can't do that. You can't create it out of nothing. And we really don't have the resources necessary.
But my time's up, Mr. Chairman. I must yield back. We can carry on later, hopefully.
Sure, happy to.
Thank you, Mr. Rakita. Ms. Hahn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And I, too, want to add my voice to those who are expressing first shock and then, of course, sympathy for the horrible train accident last night. And I will say I'm one of those politicians that Chairman Schuster was maligning earlier. Even though we have not found out what the cause is, and I'm sure we will, this is National Infrastructure Week. And I do know for sure that the funding for our infrastructure in this country is woefully inadequate. I think everybody needs to be investing more in our country's infrastructure. And, even sometimes when we find out that the cause of a train accident was human error or something else, seems that we move away from focusing on did infrastructure play a role, or are we just another bad infrastructure design away from another accident? And, folks on the morning news shows this morning were talking about our design, our outdated design of our rails and curves that maybe shouldn't be there and shared tracks. And, I think if we really want a rail system and an infrastructure that is the envy of the world, I think we're far from having the perfect infrastructure. And, other countries are investing billions more in their rail infrastructure than we are. That's, I still think that's a huge problem, and I think, our highway trust fund is running out in a few days, and maybe we'll have a short-term fix, but that's no way to run a country, and it's no way to, run rail lines. And no matter what fees we're paying, and no matter what disputes we're arbitrating, at the end of the day, I'm embarrassed about the infrastructure we have, and we just haven't put the time or effort or money into it. I do have a bill that I've introduced. It's a freight network bill, because I don't think our freight network ought to be competing with our highway trust fund. So I've got a way to take what the shippers are paying in import fees. They pay about $40 billion in import fees, and diverting some of that to a freight network guaranteed revenue stream that we can fund a lot of the things that we're talking about. I hope we take a good look, unfortunately, in light of this accident, at what, if any, role our infrastructure played or will play in future accidents in this country. And I just wanted to follow up on something that my colleague Pete DeFazio was talking about with the short line railroads. And I'm a big fan of short line, too. A lot of them service our ports, which is a huge role and also huge needed infusion of infrastructure funding in and around our ports, the last mile into our ports. I think that keeps us from being globally competitive like we should be. But of the 560 short line railroads currently operating, 27 holding companies control almost one half of these railroads. And I'm concerned that these holding companies, these investment firms, are looking at turning a profit for shareholders more than maybe investing in railroad improvements and safety. The FRA published a report on the capital needs of short-line railroads and found that while holding companies reduce the risk associated with lending capital, funding that is available must be thinly spread among all carriers under their control in order to meet current and ongoing needs. And we know there's about a $6.9 billion need for short line and regional railroads. I'd like to hear your comment on that funding mechanism for short rails, and is that a positive thing that we're seeing? Can we do better? Ms. Starr, I'd love to hear you. And then I didn't know if Mr. Hamburger and Ms. Miller, if you'd like to comment on that as well. Yeah. The economic structure of who's owning our short railroads.
Certainly, we have seen a lot of consolidation, especially in the last few years, particularly with one of our largest members. But altogether, I mean, there's really only one, maybe two publicly held companies in the short line business. So I don't know that that would be an accurate representation of our industry. Although certainly there are constraints for publicly held companies that independents don't have. I'm not sure that that is altogether a bad thing, because obviously we've seen some tremendous growth as a result of those arrangements. As to what's needed to allow our independence to grow, and the bulk of my members are independent railroads. 45G is absolutely critical to that. And 45G is a tax credit that allows us to take our earnings and reinvest them back in the track. And you made some excellent points about this being Infrastructure Week and the challenge that we're facing. If the short lines don't have access to that capital, we're not going to be able to do our part of the job for the industry. So, again, I'd like to thank everyone on the T&I committee for their overwhelming support. We've had great luck with that. But if we don't continue to follow through with 45G and make it permanent, rather than have to fight for it every year and deal with that vulnerability, we're not going to be able to engage in the long-term planning that's necessary.
Thank you. I can
Mr.
hear you tapping back there.
The time was definitely expired. Mr. Capuano.
I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank the board. This has been just as informative as I had hoped it would be. On to some extent, this is kind of ending up like a love fest, which is good. It sounds like we all want to do some minor improvements to the STB to make everybody work a little bit better and make this country better. So I want to thank you all for your input. But I do want to pick at a couple of little things that have bothered me. Mr. Hamburger, do any of your member companies, do they haul wheat?
Yes, sir.
Do they haul coal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ms. Dodd, do yours haul wheat
Yes, they do.
and coal?
Yes.
Do you know if they haul casino chips, poker chips, or casino or slot machines? You may not know that, but I thought I'd ask.
Should they?
I don't know. If somebody asked, they would.
Yes.
Mr. Hamburger,
I
do you-
believe
If
they
someone asked, we have a common carrier obligation, so absolutely.
That's what I thought. Ms. Miller, if a railroad came to you and said, we haul wheat, and so therefore we want to build a bread factory on our land in the middle of a residential area, and we want to be exempted from all health regulations. We want to be able to make that bread any way we please, not subject to local zoning, not subject to local environmental issues, not subject to local health issues. Would the STB approve that as a related activity?
I don't know in that specific example. I think you're
don't
referring
know.
to the preemption.
So you think there is a possibility that the STB would approve a railroad making bread to sell to the general public that is not subject to local health requirements? The problem is your hesitation. The problem is that there is a possibility. Would you approve them if they haul coal? Would you approve the railroad saying, by the way, we want to process coal, we want to mine coal, we want to dig oil because we haul oil, we want to frack in my backyard, not subject to state or local requirements because federal law preempts them? Is there a possibility the STB would say yes?
Well, Mr. Capuano, I think perhaps my hesitation has less to do with not knowing for sure how the STB would act, but reflecting on what I do or don't know about any authority we would have if a railroad was wanting to build a factory that had nothing to do with transporting or rail transportation.
Well, then why in the world would you approve a railroad getting into the hazardous waste business? Why in the world would you approve a railroad getting into the propane business not subject to state or local regulations? Why on earth would you say that anyone would be exempted from local safety requirements, local zoning requirements, when it's not an issue that's directly related to a railroad? Yet you've done that. Why should I have faith that the STB is not just a tool of the railroad industry and is truly an independent agency that understands, yes, when it comes to rail, we all want successful railroads. But let's be honest, trash handling is not a core item in any railroad. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. Railroad wants to get into the trash business, good luck. But your business, your entity, not necessarily you, I don't know if you were on the board at the time, said that they were no longer subject to local zoning requirements. Just last year, the STB said they are not subject to local zoning requirements on a propane facility in the middle of my state. I got to tell you, that shakes my trust in the system. I want the STB to work, and all the issues we've talked about today, they sound fine. We're heading in the right direction. That's the wrong direction. And I'd like to know what the STB might ever do about it, except to say, we're sorry, we're going to turn this issue backwards, we're going to do the right thing moving forward and stop this nonsense. Is that possible that that might happen?
I think the issue that is frustrating you, which I appreciate the frustration, I felt it myself, is the way the preemption rules play out under the federal laws. State and local laws are preempted as to having to do with rail transportation. And the frustration I think you're expressing is whether or not we've properly determined whether an activity is a part of rail transportation or if in fact it's something else. I can say that since I've been at the board, I have a strong sense of importance of the preemption requirements. One of the reasons we in fact do have such a strong rail network in the United States is because of preemption. I think it's extremely important that preemption...
I'm not arguing when it comes to the core business of railroads.
But I would also say I have seen situations that have come before the board since I've been there that I have personally found repugnant, but that I also believe fall under the preemption requirement. So even though I personally have not been supportive of what I've seen an entity doing, we have also found that they do in fact meet the requirements of preemption.
I know what you have found, but you earlier touted your background in state government. I also have a background in state and local government, and I understand that there are certain things that are conducive to federal preemption, which I support in many instances, but I don't think that applies to zoning. I don't think it applies to health. I don't think it applies to the environmental issues. Those are state and local matters, and the federal government should stay out of them. And I believe that preemption was inappropriate, wrong, and should be changed, and I guess you've left me with no choice but to now advocate for legislative change, which I actually think is always the last option. I think you've made a big mistake. I think you've opened the door to basically sticking the federal thumb in the eye of every state and every city and town in this country, and I wish that that wasn't the case, and I would like to find a way to get the STB to correct that action, but I guess we'll have to do it legislatively. Thank you, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Capuano. Mr. Mayo, if a wheat farmer and a coal miner opened a bakery, I think we've covered that topic long enough. I actually have...
I would have gone mute at this point. I would not have answered that. Thank you, though.
Actually, I have one final question, and that is, the misconception of revenue adequacy. We continue to hear how the railroads are doing so well on Wall Street, but that misconception of revenue adequacy is always out there. Can you explain in a little detail the challenge there?
Sure, and I'll try to be concise. The details are in the study that's appended to my written testimony, but what this study does is to look at the notion of revenue adequacy and to really understand the purpose of revenue adequacy. You need to go back to the time that it was introduced. It was introduced in the 1970s. It was a period when the rail industry was in dire financial and physical conditions. It was literally falling apart. In the 4R Act of 1976, the language first appeared, and it created a benchmark. It said to regulators, then the ICC, now the STB, that the regulators should calculate a number, should calculate whether railroads were earning back their cost plus a cost of capital. So it provided an informational benchmark and a set of guideposts that help legislators and regulators in assessing whether the industry was coming back and how far it had come back. So that was the legislative intent. It was a purpose. The purpose, I believe, at the time was informational, to create a set of guideposts and benchmarks. In 1985, the then ICC introduced a bit of an interpretational change, interpreting revenue adequacy not as an informational benchmark, but as a constraint. It was at that time that the word revenue adequacy constraint first appeared in the regulatory documents. And at that time, the ICC indicated that in the rail industry, that railroads should not be entitled to any more revenue than what would exactly cover their cost of capital. Now, at that time, what happened is, in theory anyway, that regulatory determination would reintroduce back into the rail industry earnings regulation, which we had just stepped out of with the Staggers Act. Now, I said in theory it did that because at that time, the railroads were, largely speaking and completely, revenue inadequate. So it was a theoretical constraint, not a practical one. Now, if you move forward 20, 30 years now, the rail industry, as we all know, is doing better financially. They are now being judged increasingly to be revenue adequate. That is to say, they're covering their cost of capital. Now, to the extent, and this is where the concerns come in my study, to the extent that the revenue adequacy constraint is then imposed and we reimpose earnings regulation in this industry, that's a risk of some significant backsliding, I think. And so what I would appeal to you and to the regulatory community is to reestablish the original legislative intent of the revenue adequacy language, and that is as an informational benchmark, which is really a good thing, but to avoid using revenue adequacy as a regulatory hammer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayo. Our final question today is from Mr. Babin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I had a couple of questions that I'd like to ask of Mr. Dooley, if you don't mind. What role can the STB play to ensure that the rail system supports manufacturing, investment, and growth?
Again, Congressman Babin, I think that, consistent with the Senate legislation, there is a directive there for STB to conclude some considerations of a host of issues that range from the rate resolution issues that are associated with a standalone cost, the requirements that in order to bring a rate case, you have to require that that company to design a rail line and operating, assess the cost of that in order to make a determination of whether or not, if you made these new investments, had an appropriate return on capital, whether or not that would result in a rate lower than what was being provided. but it provides such a complicated process that even STB commissioners said that they question whether or not that is an equitable and effective way. What the legislation also does is it asks for STB to conclude their consideration of the issue in terms of reciprocal switching, which again is, with the increased consolidation, with fewer rail lines, Class 1s that are providing service, is that there's not as much competition in the marketplace. And so what we think is important is that you ought to have a mechanism that can give a shipper the ability to ship from point A to point C through point B, but if there's only one shipper to get you to point B and you got two shippers there, that there ought to be a way to get a quote from that rate from A to B and then have the opportunity to get a competitive quote from B to C from two rail issues and have the opportunity to pay for the cost of that switch. So we think that there's progress that STB can be making on that front too that again will assure. We also have some other issues related to rate bundling that is a little more complicated that also could ensure again more competition or more competitive marketplace. And that's what we're asking for. Two things is when you have increased consolidation, you basically have a duopoly in the rail industry in many regions of the country, and that doesn't necessarily result in quite as robust marketplace forces as we think is appropriate. And how do we address for that? It's with an equitable rate resolution process as well as some of these other provisions that could be addressed through STB.
Okay, thank you very much. One other question, or am I already? No, I've still got a little time. Ms. Miller, if I could ask you, the Staggers Act established numerous objectives for U.S. freight rail policy, which wanted to minimize the need for federal regulatory control over the railroads and would allow railroads to earn adequate revenues, providing expedition, resolution of proceedings, ensuring effective competition, and maintaining reasonable rates where effective competition does not exist. How well has the STB succeeded in achieving these objectives, and what areas need the greatest attention in the future?
I think if you look back over the last 35 years since Staggers has passed, you'd have to say that the STB's done an outstanding job. When you look at the issue of rate regulation, to the extent the Surface Transportation Board has any involvement at all, it's only 10% really of any of the traffic or rate regulation that we even have any oversight over. Anything that's done by contract we're not involved in. That's the vast majority of what's moving on the freight system today is done under contract. In other situations, even though there may not be a contract, they might be using tariff. There's clearly competition. We're not involved there. So our role really is a pretty small role, but in an area that I think becomes very important. I think that in a year of serving on the board, my observation is that to the extent we are, in fact, to be an arbitrator of whether or not rates are reasonable where competition doesn't exist, if there's a criticism that I would have of the board is that I can understand why shippers feel so frustrated and say to us, we don't really feel like we have an opportunity to bring cases before you. We can say that we're available. We can say that you can file a rate case, but what we know is that it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years. It's going to cost millions of dollars, and the reality of actually doing that has quite a chilling effect, I think, on a number of shippers. So Mr. Hamburger made the comment, and he is absolutely right. We are talking oftentimes about hundreds of millions of dollars. There is no way to take that sort of a rate process and turn it into a 6-month activity. The issues are much too complicated. They are much too important. So I'm not saying that our goal at the board should be to rush to judgment on any of these things. Some of these questions are simply going to take some time to get at. But by the same token, I don't think there's any question that there are people who feel they have an issue that they would like to have addressed who simply don't bring it before us because they think it's hopeless.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all the witnesses, too.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Ms. Brown, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to say that last night I started getting calls about the accident that occurred in Philadelphia, and I want everybody to know that my heart goes out to the family and the community at this time. I mean, rail is so important, and reauthorization of the Stag Act and investing in rail is crucial. it is absolutely crucial that we work to keep freight rail, and passenger rail separated. And, other countries have figured it out, and we as people in the United States need to get with it. I tell people all the time in Florida, our competition is not Georgia and Alabama. It's people in other countries that have figured out how to move goods and services. And when I travel around the world, they ask me, how do you all have such a great freight system? And I want to know from them, how do you have such a great passenger system? And we in the United States need to figure out, and we need to invest in making sure that we can move people, goods, and services. So I want to thank you all for your testimony. And do any of the members, I know Mrs. Miller, he was tapping, do you want to make any closing statements? And Mr. Hamburger, anybody want to make any closing statements? I'm now on Veterans Affairs, and I appreciate the fact that over 30 to 40% of the people in rail are veterans. And I thank you all for continuing to reach out to them because they are ready for employment. And Mrs. Miller, you want to add anything?
No, I really appreciate your comments and would echo your statements. I've always been amazed by the U.S. transportation system. I think it's extraordinarily important, and I am struck all the time, as you said, our competition. I came from the state of Kansas. I felt the same way. Our competition wasn't the states next door. It's other countries around the world, and I think we need to continue to think that way. And one of our advantages economically is our freight transportation system. It's extremely important that we maintain that advantage.
My colleague, Ms. Dooley.
No, I have no other statement, but I, again, thank the committee for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. Mr. Hamburg.
I would just like to, on a personal note, say I know that you had a Veterans Affairs Committee meeting this morning, and the fact that you made it here just underscores your dedication and support for the rail industry, and I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Brown, I just wanted to echo on your thoughts about the Amtrak accident last night. And I think, it's appropriate that we talk about safety today. And from the short line perspective, there are two critical aspects of safety that we can help out with. One is raising up the safety culture in our industry, which we're able to do through the Short Line Safety Institute, thanks to support from Congress. And then finally, focusing on our rail infrastructure. By improving the track, we improve safety, and we're able to do that through programs like 45G. So I think it's a good partnership, and appreciate your support for both of those programs.
Thank you. Last comment.
So I, too, would echo your reflections about the need to look abroad for benchmarking and identifying that our real area of competitiveness is best benchmarked around the world, not necessarily here in the States. I would say in the context of this hearing that it's really sort of important once in a while. I mean, we're pretty good at pounding our chest and chanting we're number one in the world, even if we're not necessarily that way. In this particular area, in the area of freight rail policy, I think we have a lot to be proud of. The economic data are very clear. It's rather remarkable as an economist to see an alignment of positive economic indicators in prices, output, innovation, employment, and so on that have worked so well. So I'm just glad to be here and to speak about this bill or this act.
Well, thank you very much. And like I said, I don't care whether I'm in Russia, no matter where I am around the world, they always ask me about our freight rail. And depending on where I am, whether I'm in Europe or someplace, I'm asking them about their passenger rail. So thank you again all for your testimony. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Cummings, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for getting here so late. I was in another hearing where I'm ranking. I want to express my condolences to those who were injured in last night's terrible accident, to the families of the victims who died. I also want to express my strong support for Amtrak. Tens of millions of passengers ride the Northeast Corridor every year, including millions who pass through Penn Station in my district in Baltimore. Amtrak is an essential component of our nation's transportation infrastructure. Sadly, Republicans on the House Appropriations Committee have proposed cutting capital funding for this service by 25% in fiscal year 2016. While we cannot speculate on the causes of last night's accident, media reports indicate that it occurred in a sharp curve, and there are many such curves and tight turns along this very old corridor. We would never find it acceptable to operate the Congress using 19th century technology, and yet we continue to operate many stretches of the Northeast Corridor under 19th century infrastructure. Rather than cutting our investments, we should be expanding them and taking all steps necessary to bring the Northeast Corridor into a state of good repair. Now, Mr. Hamburger, can you discuss the trends you've seen in the rail industry's investment in infrastructure, both during and after the financial crisis, and have railroad investment trends changed in these years?
Thank you, Mr. Cummings, and you were not here earlier, but I do want to associate myself with your remarks about, as I did earlier, the tragedy last evening. The very interesting chart, which I can provide for the record, what we saw in 2008, 9, and 10 was a very minor drop-off in the amount of CapEx that the industry put into the network. If you go back to 2002, the previous recession, 2001 and 2, we saw a dramatic drop-off. When the economy came roaring back, we were not ready for it. And I think what our members individually decided was while there was some decline, about a 10% perhaps, if memory serves, that there was a need to continue to invest. Many of our members kept the employees that they furloughed on part-time status so that they continued to be qualified to be called back and continue to receive their benefits, so that those investments continue to be made. Now, the service disruptions of 13 and 14 would undercut my argument that we were ready, but there were a lot of factors that went into that service challenge. But we took the money that we were earning and put it back into the network, the same as we're doing now at record amounts.
Now, Mr. Miller, you wrote in your testimony that in July, the Staggers Transportation Board will hold a hearing to explore issues pertaining to the concept of revenue adequacy. You also wrote that revenue adequacy is an economic concept that describes whether a carrier is earning sufficient revenue to cover its costs and earn a reasonable return. And so you indicated that the board makes a determination about revenue adequacy annually. Is that right?
That's correct.
You also wrote that the board is beginning to see that some of the Class 1 railroads are becoming revenue adequate across consecutive years. Can you explain how revenue adequacy is calculated? And is there a threshold of investment and profit that...
No, I think you meant to direct that to the professor at the end of the table.
Oh, I'm sorry, Professor.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just teasing you because this complicated economic...
I'm tired, so I don't confuse me.
I'm sorry.
It's been a long day already. Go ahead.
No, I have my cheat sheet on how it is calculated. I don't know that we need to go into, the.
But you see where I'm getting at. I'm trying to figure out, when we talk about adequacy, I'm trying to figure out what the threshold is, and how do we measure that? You follow me?
Yes, I do follow you, and so I hope the professor won't be totally offended by the way I'm going to no doubt make a mess of his economics. But when we're looking at revenue adequacy, we're not looking at the question of are railroads profitable. It's a different question. The question is can they attract adequate capital? Because we want them to be able to attract the capital to continue to expand as they have been. So what we're looking at is a little different question. What the board does now is it calculates a cost of capital and then does a comparison between what the railroads what their revenue is against that cost of capital. And if it's greater than the cost of capital, we would say for that year they are revenue adequate. What we're also trying to determine, and one of the reasons we're going to have the hearing, is if you want to declare a railroad revenue adequate, should they be revenue adequate for 1 year? Should it be 5 years? Should it be over some period of time? What is that period of time? And so how do we make those determinations? And then more importantly still, I think the question on the table is, if we've concluded there is a railroad that is revenue adequate, does that say anything about how they should be economically regulated? Should it change because they are now in a changed circumstance of revenue adequacy? And those are the questions we're going to be exploring in our hearing in July.
Right. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings, and thank you to each of you that came to testify today. If there are no other questions, I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open.
Mr. Chairman, could I possibly, at the risk of offending you, end today's hearing on an upbeat note, perhaps a kumbaya moment between Mr. Dooley and myself? You may not have noticed in this morning's Washington Post, page 11, that the plastics industry is pumping out jobs. A report coming out of the ACC today, $130 billion of investment over the next 5 years in the U.S. That's good news for our jobs. It's good news for the American economy. And I trust it's good news for railroads as we'll get more business from Mr. Dooley. Absolutely. But congratulations to you and your members. It's a very upbeat note, and I appreciate you allowing me to put it in the record. Thank you.
We would ask that each of our witnesses be provided questions. Unanimous consent to the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members of witnesses to be included in today's record. Without objection so ordered, I'd like to thank again each of you for being here to testify today. If no members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.